In this tutorial, we're going to draw an interesting castle scene. This lesson will focus on some pen techniques like hatching, but also how we use shadow and light and detail to make pen drawing scenes and landscapes appear realistic, three-dimensional, and intriguing to the viewer. Hatching is a foundational part of pen drawing, and for this lesson today, it's really important that we get some practice in before we start drawing the rocks in this lovely castle. When I hatch, I keep my wrist in a neutral position, meaning my wrist isn't bent upwards or downwards. It's resting naturally on the page. When I move my pen and when I move my fingers, I'm just moving them. I'm not moving the wrist up and down. You can see how a line drawn this way allows me for a little bit more control over the thickness of the line and the direction rather than trying to move my whole hand down. When I get down here, you can see the line start to curve. If we draw a little practice square, or I guess a diamond, we're going to try to hatch this. Basically, hatching involves us drawing these vertical lines over and over again. The difficult part, I think, is making sure that the lines fall within the square, within the object you're drawing. You can see how some of my lines go outside this area. That's not a huge problem. In fact, it makes the drawings often look a little bit more organic and natural, I find, when there's some imperfections. But as you develop your own pen drawing style, you can kind of see what works for you. To start off, we're going to draw the base of our castle. We want these lines to kind of stretch up. It's okay if they're a little bit wiggly and wobbly. And they are kind of in the upper part of the page. If you draw a line in the middle of our castle, it's kind of in the upper quadrant of the page. Now this involves using the rule of thirds, and the rule of thirds is a basic rule in photography and art that suggests that the most important parts of your drawing or image should kind of fall along the lines of the page if the page is kind of subdivided into 9 equal rectangles. Now, there's a lot of artists, me included, who don't think this is a useful way to think about art because it kind of limits how we compose our drawings. But it can be a useful way to start out. That's because the rule of thirds can kind of suggest where we place the most important parts of our drawing, gives us a starting block to kind of run with when we draw interesting compositions like this one. We have the two sides of our castle here. Now, because the castle is up farther on the page, we want to make it seem like we're almost looking up at it. Now this can be a little bit tricky to get with pen, but I find you can either switch to a pencil or start it with pen, because what we want to do here is draw a nice gentle arc that connects these two lines. You can see how I'm using a 01 pen and I'm creating the arc without actually connecting all the lines. So that means I can kind of correct it if it seems like it doesn't fit. A really great way of drawing these kind of circular shapes from below is drawing the entire circle. So I can kind of sketch in the circle and kind of imagine it being a see-through tube, so to speak. In that way, you can see how, imagine we're looking through this castle upwards. We can see the back side of the castle kind of curving around behind it. Often it's easier for us to kind of sketch in those circular shapes over time with pencil and then kind of choosing the most correct line to go with. We can see how this gentle arc allows us to now kind of work on adding a roof. So I'm going to kind of shadow this arc with another line because the roof is going to protrude out of the castle here. I have a little gentle little lip of the castle, and then I'm going to kind of dot in a line right in the middle of the castle. Now this is going to form our roof, and we want to gently kind of bring these lines up. Now you can see how there's some wibbles and wobbles in how I drew this roof, and that's all right. In fact, I think these wiggly lines really make the style of pen drawing a little bit more unique than if everything was straight up and down. We'll return to adding details to this castle by the end of the lesson, but for now, let's start to add that rocky, kind of rocky outcropping beneath the castle itself. So I'm going to continue some of these lines down, and you can see when I'm using this lovely 01 pen, I can kind of quickly jet out lines and then draw them down on a sharper angle. Now, because we're drawing rock, we want these lines to be kind of fairly straight, but again, we don't have to use a ruler here. I'm creating an outline of the rocks first, and then I'm going to go inside our scene and kind of replicate those shapes I created with some interesting up and down lines to kind of suggest that there's rocks here and make the scene look a little bit more three-dimensional. Before we add shading to these rocks, we can add a little bit of vegetation maybe around the base of the castle, kind of make it look like a realistic kind of growth situation is happening here. And again, you'll notice a lot of lines, whether it's the rocks or this vegetation, I'm creating by a really sharp kind of pointed line that I kind of drag out on the page, and as I drag really quickly and draw quickly, the lines get smaller. You can see that kind of line, as opposed to a short line or a line that's slow, that's thicker. A quick line allows us to get that nice taper on the end of it. Now we'll add some more grass by the end of this lesson. But for now, we're going to start adding that hatching method I talked about on the rocks to make them look three-dimensional. Now we can imagine the rocks here are these kind of sharp, large rectangles. We want to think about where the sun's coming from. So if the sun's coming from the left-hand side of the page, that means the right-hand side of the rocks are going to be in shadow. We can start by adding some hatching to this rock here in the middle. You can see how I added a little bit of hatching, and then I added some wiggly lines here, some vegetation at the base of the rock. And just with those short few lines, it makes the rock look a little bit three-dimensional, as in the top of the rock is in the sunlight and the side is in shadow. We can do the same to this rock up here. And maybe add a little crack and some more shading here. You can see how we're effectively fleshing out the rocks, or almost carving out the rocks, by the shadows that we add. It's the shadows that make these three-dimensional shapes appear three-dimensional. By shading in the rocks here on the side and leaving this rock white, it even makes it more appear as if this rock is kind of in a yard of rocks, or there's a whole bunch of rock action going around. We can do the same thing with this rock here, shading in the side with our hatching method that we talked about at the beginning of this lesson, and adding some vegetation at the bottom of the rock to make it look more grounded and natural. And even up at the top, right below the base of our tower. Now, ink drawing is all about those light and dark sections. It's the shadows that make our scenes appear three-dimensional and lifelike. So focusing on where we place those shadows is really important, and knowing where to leave things white and light is really important as well. As you kind of hatch in the rocks, think about just as much as where you're placing the shadows, where the lighter sections of the rocks are, and where the sun would hit those sections of rock. You can get a little creative too at the bottom here, adding some cracks in the rock and some smaller sections of shading. As well, we can add some vegetation here too. You can see how adding this vegetation in between the rocks makes the scene look a little bit more three-dimensional as well. If you want to get really crazy, you can add some leaves. And some more vegetation here. And maybe I'll shade in this rock too. You can see how adding vegetation in front of the rocks here gives the impression as well of their kind of rockiness. It's adding those details that kind of allow our minds to fill in the blanks. That's what I really love about drawing. Just by these small lines here, it really makes the eye perceive this whole shape as three-dimensional, with the vegetation in front of it, the shadows to the right of it, and vegetation behind it as well. Just with a few lines, we've started to create the impression of these rocks as being three-dimensional, kind of beefy, rectangular shapes that contrast the flowing organic shapes of the grass around them. It's important not to overdraw here. We don't want to add too much grass. We don't want to add too much shading around the rocks. I really love keeping these drawings a little bit light and flowing. And if we added a lot of shading around the rocks, it would unnecessarily crowd out the shading of the rocks themselves, make the scene appear a little bit too dark. With how light the face of these rocks are on the left-hand side, it really gives the impression that this is a sunlit scene. And if the grass was all dark, it would make the rocks seem a little bit too white or a little bit too contrasting, I believe. This method also gives you a lovely amount of freedom with the shapes of the rocks that we create. You can basically draw any three sides, add some hatching, and then add our grass to the left-hand side of these rocks. For some added realism and perspective, we can make the rocks appear a little bit more detailed and larger when they get closer to us. So for example, this rock here that I've drawn, I can add a couple different sections of shading and then add some really light lines on the edge of the shading itself. This kind of highlights the contrast of these shaded areas. I can also add some cracks on the rock too, making the outline of the rock a little bit more uneven and jagged, adding some lovely details that really sucks the viewer in, I think, when you're looking at a three-dimensional scene like this. Now you can spend as much time on these rocks as you wish, adding details, adding other areas of shading, adding vegetation, maybe even try some moss. But now we're going to add a little bit of detail to the castle itself. Let's start with a door, because doors are very fun and kind of suck the viewer in as well, because we can wonder what would happen if we walked through that door, who might be inside. Drawing those two lines up in an arc on the top of it, and then let's draw some wooden slates or slats, wooden boards on this door itself. We're going to use the hatching method to shade this in, because we can imagine that this door is a darker material than the castle around it. We can then add a couple windows. So on the left-hand side, this window is going to be kind of facing away from us because the castle curls around. So we want it to be a little bit thinner. But then a window in the middle, we can draw a little bit wider. This kind of gives the impression that this window is the same as this one because it's the same height. However, because this window is curving around the side of the castle, we see it in perspective. Perspective shrinks the width of the window because it's kind of on an angle to us. However, because we're looking up at these windows, we want to draw a little bit of the top of the window as well, because we're looking up, we can see the bottom side of the top of the window, and we'll just shade that in. But castles often are made of stone, so we want to add some stone texture too. Adding an arc around the door and some stone around there. This is where it gets a little bit tricky, and we won't spend a lot of time on this lesson, but basically to add our stone, we're going to kind of mirror the top side of the castle, that arc that we see up there, and mirror it as we come down the castle. We'll see I'm dotting in this arc, this upward arc, throughout the castle texture. This method of adding these lines can be a little bit challenging and might take you some time. That's all right. This drawing is meant to be a practice, and I'm replicating these lines as we go down the castle, making them more condensed and thinner as we go. And you can see how a lot of these lines are not even. They're not even matching the top of the castle outline, and that's all right because we're added some detail to the front of this scene with this rock and maybe some more vegetation down here. We can perceive that the castle is farther away, meaning the visible details on the castle would be fewer. Because we've added these little lines, it kind of gives the impression of stonework on the castle without us having to actually draw it in. We can add a few bricks here at the top of the castle or the beginning of the castle, at the front face of the castle, and kind of make those appear a little bit shorter and smaller towards the sides. But we really don't have to do much on the castle itself because we can see these small little lines and our eyes kind of fill in the blanks and imagine that they are bricks. I'm going to color in the underside of the castle because, again, the sun's coming from the left-hand side. And then I'm going to add some hatching to the right-hand side of the castle because it would be in shadow. I'm hatching one side here, and then I'm going to hatch with lines a little bit farther apart on another level of hatching. That's because on circular shapes like this, there's no kind of abrupt lines for shadow. The shadows kind of are blended because there's no hard edges. If this is a square castle, one side would be completely in shadow, the other side would be completely in light. We can shade the side in shadow a little bit darker, adding another layer of hatching over top of the layer we just used. And we can also do the same to the roof. And because the shadow is casting a shadow, or the castle is casting a shadow, it can be interesting to replicate some of the shapes we have in our scene in shadow, completely kind of covered in ink. So we have the rocks in light, and then a few rocks here in shadow as well. I can draw in some vegetation a little bit darker too, and bring that shading down a little bit. And you can really add as much detail to this castle as you please. I think a little bit of jaggedy, kind of loose lines on the roof could be effective, as well maybe a nice little flagpole with a tattered flag here. And remember, it's the details that we add at the front of our scene with more detailed rocks and vegetation that allow us to leave the castle a little bit undetailed. Because it's farther away, we perceive fewer details, meaning that the small little sketchy lines we did add mean a lot more. They tell us a lot more about the scene. Now, an interesting way of finishing the scene with a background is going to be, I think it could be interesting to kind of replicate what we've done here, but farther away and mirrored with less detail. What I mean by that is I'm going to draw in the outline of these rocks, but the other direction. And then, because it's farther away even still, I'm just going to give it a small, very, very light hatching job. Now, I'm hatching with the side of my pen, and if you're using a rollerball pen or something, it might not work as smoothly as this. But because this background is farther away, I can kind of start my line at the edge and then drag down very softly or very abruptly, keeping the lines very, very light. And then why not? Why don't we add another background here? Maybe just the edge of a mountain. Doesn't really matter what that line looks like. And fade it out even more. Drawing those lines even lighter. Continuing it by the castle here. You can see that the contrast of the hatched area background even adds more detail and kind of more juxtaposition or contrast to the light kind of sunlit rocks that we drew here. It's by adding contrast and shading and adding contrast and detail that we can really create interesting kind of dynamic compositions and drawings with pen. And that's, I think, been the thrust of this lesson this week, is that by adding shadow smartly, we can then highlight the light sections of our drawing. And by adding detail in interesting ways at the beginning or the front of our composition, we can then add less detail farther back, but our eyes perceive those small kind of undetailed sections as more detailed. Now, I'd invite you to kind of continue this drawing as you wish, add more details and have fun with the scene. And also let me know what you draw down in the comments, or let me know what you thought of this tutorial. Was it helpful? I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe for more tutorials just like this one, as well as other sorts of drawing videos as well.